What's up? Speed Theory Performance back with another BMW DIY. Today, we'll change out our open differential for an M3 limited slip. Laid out is everything required for the swap, plus some tips and tricks to help you install one in your car. We'll cover the uninstall, driveshaft modification, install, and the coding of the DSC module, so stay tuned and enjoy. First thing you're going to do is remove both the hub covers, exposing the axle nut on both the driver and the passenger sides. You need to pry open the axle nut release clips or tabs. They're pushed into the L shape in the axle, as you can see. Use a heavy screwdriver and a hammer to accomplish. The front of the car has been jacked up. You're going to want the rear tires planted, the e-brake applied to help you release the axle nut. Using the 36mm 12-pointed socket and a breaker bar, release the nut. Notice how easy it is. Remove with a ratchet or an impact. Both the nuts are removed, go ahead and jack the rear of the car up. First layer that needs to get removed from your car is the exhaust and the heat shielding. VRSF is making it super easy with only 2 detachment points. If you need to see how to remove your exhaust, check out our exhaust video. I'm not really going to focus on it here, I'm just showing that that's the first thing that needs to get removed. Alright, now whatever exhaust you have is removed and the heat shielding, here is the rear half of the drive shaft and where it connects to the differential and the axle assemblies, as you can see. Next thing we're going to need to do is remove the 50mm nut. Alright, this is what the 50mm nut looks like. Here I have my crow's foot wrench on a ratchet. Here's a little trick I use to loosen this nut. It's going to turn towards the passenger side. Your trans is either in park or gear with the e-brake off. Once it's loose, fully remove the drive shaft from the differential. Once the drive shaft diff nut is released, using an 18mm ratchet and wrench, remove all 3 of the trans flange bolts from the guibo. Placing the transmission in neutral and rotating it will help make this job effortless. Center support bearing. To remove this hanger assembly, remove the 2 14mm bolts holding it in place. It is a good idea to have a jack or jack stands available to help assist and lower the drive shaft out safely. Using a transmission jack here to help keep it in place. My drive shaft / differential nut did not want to fully loosen, so I had to remove it in one unit. As I just mentioned, my nut did not want to fully release on the car. It started to strip a bit, so instead of making it worse, I just kept going and removed it all in one assembly. I left this in the video to show things do not always go as planned and you need to find alternate means to complete the tasks. I have a transmission jack under the diff. Next thing to do is to remove the 6 output shaft bolts from each side. There is a total of 12. Using E14, remove all 12. To gain access, you'll have to put the car in neutral and spin the shaft to access all the bolts. Place it back in gear with the e-brake applied. I found that it was easiest to remove the first set of bolts from both sides of the car. Before you spun the axles to gain access to the out of reach ones was a major time saver. Okay, the next thing you're going to remove are the carrier bolts, starting with the upper rear bolt. It's a 21mm. You'll need a socket and a wrench. I would recommend something supporting the weight of the diff as it loosens to help support the weight and it doesn't drop uncontrollably. Once the 21mm is loosened, remove the two 18mm bolts using a socket and wrench as well. At this point, the diff is loose and ready to be removed. Lower the jack and slide the diff assembly out and away from the car. Here it is, it's out of the car. Right, here's that 50mm bolt that started to strip, so I just removed the entire assembly before the damage became too irreversible. I was still able to remove it, I just didn't do it fully in the car. Here's a side-by-side comparison of the stock diff versus the M3 LSD. I think that is a much better option when considering an LSD conversion for your E90. The M factory is nice, but I think that the M3 LSD offers a much bigger and stronger helical system. As you can see the size difference, plus it has a beefier axle assembly and the output shaft connection. Plus the output for the drive shaft is much stronger in ability to transfer power. I think this is the winner when considering an LSD for your E90. I will preface this section that in the description there will be a link to an article on how to properly measure BMW drive shafts, balancing, all the information you need to know. Alright, you really want the car planted and the system installed to get the initial measurements, especially for the value of what's going to be applied to the M3 one, the measurement. Okay, here's the 335i diff and different drive shaft mocked up to illustrate where and how to get your measurements. Start by going from the diff's ear face and measure to the center of the bolt hole on the center support bearing, illustrated in the video, and record that number. Looks something like this. Alright, record that. Then from the center of the center support bearing to the front of the flange in between the guibo and the flange face. Make sure it's metal to metal with your tape measure on the flange. And record this number. This is going to be the most important number. Right, for my drive shaft, I needed to shorten it about 7/8 of an inch. Yours will vary. So a quick tip, since you cannot measure the system, the M3 system in the car, mount it and squared, mock it up similarly how I have it here. You're going to zip tie the drive shaft to the input of the diff, support the drive shaft, use a level, and get the most accurate measurement you can. Once this is done, both for the 335i and the M3, the difference, probably from the front half of the drive shaft, as the rear lengths are identical, well, what needs to be shortened off the M3 to make sure it fits in your 335i. The flange from the 335i will have to be welded to the M3 at whatever difference you find. I'd recommend that if you can, purchase a front half or another 335i drive shaft from eBay for 60 to 90 bucks and use that one. So if there's any mistakes made, that you can put the 335i, diff, and drive shaft back into place. The next thing in the uninstall is to remove the stock axles. I am using a hub remover stud to knock out the axles from the hub. These should slide out fairly easily, and if they do not, stop tapping them out. You can damage the threads, and if that happens, you're going to need to press them out, and you'll need to rethread them, which can cost a lot of extra money. I had to rethread my M3 axles. Fortunately, my 335i ones came out fairly easily. As you can see, the axles are removed. Make sure you do not damage the boots behind the hub. For good measure, it is a good idea to label each of the axles with a paint marker, simply driver and passenger side. I am upgrading my bushings while I have all of this disassembled. I'm using a ball joint press and it worked flawlessly. There's plenty of room to fit the tool for removal, and here's how I set it up. One thing to facilitate the use of the tool is to loosen the 12mm bolts that mount the e-brake lines. This just helps negotiate them over obstacles and creates more wiggle room while you have the tool on one of the bushing housings. To make the bushing removal even easier, heat the bushing carrier up with a torch or a heat gun. This makes pressing the bushing out like butter. The cup is mounted towards the front of the car. The bushing is pressed. I'm upgrading the stock bushings with POWERFLEX Black Performance Polyurethane bushings. Here's a quick overview of how I prep them for install. I started coating the bolt carrying rod with anti-seize. I found this the best lubrication for poly bushings. It is the longest lasting and provides the least amount of squeaks. Repeat this for all parts of the bushings, minus the washers. Once all the bushings are fully coated, you're ready for install. Let's move to the bushing carriers under the car and get those ready for prep. prep the housing, fully clean it, and apply a thin layer of anti-seize. Now you're ready to insert the front and rear poly assemblies. Simply press them in with your finger pressure. Next, carefully tap in the bolt carrier rod into place. Make sure the bushings are fully seated against the housing. Clean off the excess anti-seize to complete the install of the POWERFLEX bushings. Now we're ready to install the M3 LSD. Let's get to it. Here's the M3 drive shaft. It has already been modified. I prepped the drive shaft by changing the center support bearing and installing the guibo prior to installing anything else. The drive shaft shop did an amazing job and went above and beyond balancing, attaching the flange, and refurbishing the drive shaft. First thing to do to prep the drive shaft is remove the 18mm bolt. It's located in between the center support bearing and the universal joint. Before we separate the two portions of the drive shaft, make an alignment mark so that it can be rematched once it's put back together. The drive shaft is balanced in the configuration that you dropped it off at, so preserve that with the alignment mark, so to maintain the shop's balancing. It can prevent headaches in the future. For the center support bearing install, you will have to have the 335i carrier attached to the M3 bearing. Whether you purchase a new center support bearing or not, start by removing the M3 carrier. It's easier if you leave the bearing attached to the spline. Repeat for the 335i center support bearing. The 335i bearing will not fit over the diameter of the M3 splines. Carefully and gently lubricate the carrier housing with the correct rubber orientation. Take note from your 335i drive shaft. Tap the carrier into place, ensuring it's fully seated. I used the end of a screwdriver and gently tapped in the 4 cardinal directions until it's fully seated and in the correct orientation. The flat rubber portion facing up as depicted. And there you have it. The center support bearing is correctly installed and spins freely. Align your paint markers and tighten down the 18mm bolt. To finish up the drive shaft, we need to attach the guibo or flex tip. Alright, for the guibo, I attempted to highlight the arrows. There are 2 sets of 3 arrows marked with purple and white in this case. These need to be attached correctly. In this case, I marked the arrows aligning the disc to the flange in purple. Align the 3 purple arrows and tap into place, and you will notice that there are alignment dowels on the disc. One for the transmission flange and one for the drive shaft flange. Do not mix these up. Alright, next apply medium thread locker to the bolts and feed them from left to right. Once all 3 bolts are installed, torque them to 45 foot-pounds. With the center support bearing and guibo installed, your drive shaft is prepped and ready to be installed. Next, we'll install the axles and LSD to finish up this project. Next are the axles. I just wanted to do a quick comparison of the 335i and the M3 axle. This is just to show that the M3 swap is a better option over the M factory. The axles are thicker and the output shafts are much larger and capable of transferring power, aka facilitating your launch. I would go with this option over the M factory. If you measure the M3 axle, it is about 1.7 inches in diameter, while the 335i is just about 1.4, 1.5-ish. So people that are breaking axles, the LSD will not stop that per se. So again, I think this is the appropriate swap for power management and launch control. Right. For the install, I'm using the axle puller. This pulls the splines through the hub, and it is used in conjunction with some wrenches. Use the bungee cord to support the weight. This is a good $80 investment. Do not hit the axles into place. Risk of unseen damage is very high. Start the axle into the hub by aligning the splines and then pushing it into place. I understand that not everyone will be using this puller tool, so it has been abbreviated here. Just like that, complete. Now that both axles are in place, you can loosely thread the new axle nuts on. However, you will not torque them down until the wheel is back on and the car's weight is seated on the ground. At that point, you can torque them to 200 foot-pounds plus 90 degrees and apply some blue thread locker. Alright, for the install of the LSD, I secured it on the transmission jack just like I did for the uninstall. I did some preventative maintenance on the diff. I replaced both the seals. I popped off the cover to inspect the helical inside, the actual LSD element. I reapplied gasket maker to the surface. I popped the cover back on, torque those to 40 foot-pounds. I filled it with a redline fluid, but according to the TIS, BMW recommends a castor oil. It's up to you. If it has been just drained and filled, the capacity is 1.1 liters. If it's been completely drained and cleaned, kind of what I've done, or if you remove the element, it's 1.2 liters. Alright, luckily this diff came with a magnetic drain plug, but when I drained the fluid out of it initially, the magnet had quite a bit of material on it. So I definitely would recommend one of these, as it can help keep metal materials or any foreign particles that are magnetic out of the fluid. That increases the diff's life and doesn't interfere with the gearing system. Alright, these are 14mm Allens and they're both torqued to 15 foot-pounds. In the description will be a link to a site that has every ratio for all different models and chassis, so you can best choose which one to purchase for your car. It has from E30s to E90s and all the submodels and the transmission types, so you can compare and contrast. It basically boils down for E90s though is that the manuals will use a DCT M3 rear end and the autos will use a 6-speed manual. I am using the 6-speed. That put me at a max at a 1.5 ratio higher or lower depending on the gear. And that translated to about a 1 to 5 plus or minus in miles per hour depending on the gear, and less than a 0.5-ish increase in overall final drive, so it's pretty good. Alright, before install I just had to define the carrier bolt assembly label. The upper cover bolt carrier is bolt group 2. Alright, the 2 ears are bolt group 1. Here's the final product. The LSD has been installed. You simply lift it into place with a transmission jack and align the bolt carrier groups. Once they're aligned, you're going to insert group 1 first and then group 2. For group 1, make sure the washer is in front of the bolt. Do not torque down, just release the jack at this point, put the full weight of the assembly on the carrier and set it into place. Then you're going to torque down group 1 bolts to 100 foot-pounds. Alright, do not forget to reinstall your exhaust hangers. Alright, finish up with group 2 bolts, and those are torqued down to 120 foot-pounds. I do quickly want to highlight that before you, I just quickly want to brush over a detail that you'll need to check for when purchasing a rear end. There may be special balancing required if you have a certain marking on your diff. It also requires an exact drive shaft for that assembly, so keep that in mind when purchasing the rear. To see if this applies to your rear end, there are 2 spots to look. It'll be at the 12 or 6 o'clock positions, behind the flange, or inside the flange itself. Alright, the 3 colors you're looking for are white or absence of a color, blue, or yellow. I'll put a link in the description of the TIS which explains this in full detail and what the colors mean. Right, for the axle hubs to the flanges, install is the reversal of uninstall. Align the hub and hand thread all 6 bolts each side and their pressure plates and torque down to 85 foot-pounds. Alright, last thing we need to do is install this drive shaft. I installed the drive shaft by working from front to rear and finishing with the center support bearing. Install the flex disc, keeping in mind to make sure those alignment dowels are fully inserted into the flange. Install is reversal of uninstall and torque to 50 foot-pounds plus 90 degrees. Align the rear output of the drive shaft to the input of the differential. Hand tight the bolts with blue thread locker. Work in a star pattern. Slowly tighten the bolts down until they're all tight. Next, torque them to 40 foot-pounds plus 90 degrees, separated by time. Alright, lastly, ensure that the center support bearing is oriented correctly. Align the bearing with the holes. Tighten the bolts to 15 foot-pounds. Note that you can see the imprint of where the bolt hole tabs were previously aligned. Use them to help with the reinstall. Alright, at this point check all your connections, put the car in neutral and make sure that everything spins. Note that both the wheels, or brake rotors in this case, will spin in the same direction now. Reinstall the heat shielding, exhaust, and tires. Everything's buttoned up. Lastly, with the wheel planted on the ground, tighten the axle nut to 200 foot-pounds plus 100 degrees. That's it. She's in. Here's the coating procedures using NCS Expert. That document will be included in the description. And here is the coding procedure. That's the end of another video. If you guys like this video and would like to continue to see videos like this and many others, think about subscribing. Don't forget to like and share these videos. Also check out our Instagram. Browse through our video library. If there is something you'd like to see, don't forget to leave it down in the comments below. Alright guys, enjoy.